Hello everybody. Welcome to another little training video where I'll share some ideas with you, tell you how they went in my classroom. This week it's going to be all about Genesis, chapters 18 through 22. So really the story of Abraham and Sarah. I start with their names being changed, go through the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, the promise of Abraham's son Isaac being born, and then, of course, in Genesis 22, Abraham being commanded to sacrifice Isaac. So here's some of the things that I decided to do this week, and I'll tell you how some of them went. So, number one, what's in a name? This is back in Genesis 17, but I realized that I hadn't covered the idea of Abram and Sarai's names being changed to Abraham and Sarah. Really had a good discussion about it, talked with them about when they changed their names. When they go on a mission, they'll be elder and sister. When they get married, oftentimes the lady will choose to change her name. And then we also talked about when they got baptized, they take the name of Christ upon themselves. And so we likened the changing of names and how it fits with covenants. And when we make covenants with the Lord, oftentimes there's a name change involved so that we remember the covenant that we made. And so it was a good little discussion that I had with them on that. Then I went into the story of Isaac being born, but started with this quote from President Uchtdorf that's in the curriculum about patience, and prayers aren't necessarily answered as quickly or in the way we might hope, but according to the Lord's timing. And then we went into how they were promised a son, but they'd been promised a son back in previous chapters. This is like a reiteration of the promise, and it was really a good thing that we talked about it and talked about how they waited another 20 years after the initial promise. And there was a little bit of doubt, a little bit of hesitation, maybe not doubt, but wondering how this was going to come about. And in doing so, I took them also to Luke 1:37 after the phrase of "Is anything too hard for the Lord?" Then went to Luke 1:37, where Mary is told, "With God nothing shall be impossible," and had a great discussion about that in our own lives. I then showed this video with President Uchtdorf, Continue in Patience. You'll remember it. If I just skip here, you'll see the little marshmallow test that he talked about, and then about his time in the army and how people were passing him, and he thought, why is that when I'm the one that should be getting blessings? And so then afterwards we talked about this marshmallow test, and I said, now let's change it from marshmallows to cell phones. I said, let's say that you're sat at a table, your cell phone is in front of you, and you're told not to touch it for an hour or something like that. And could you do it? And things like that. The students talked about how, that would work depending on what the blessing was, depending on what the reward was. And so we talked about incentives and looking for the blessings of the Lord, and had a good discussion about that. Then there's this quote from Elder Bednar. In a couple of my classes, I used it one class. I just skipped over it. It can be good, but it can also be something you skip if you're running short on time. I then talked to him about Sodom and Gomorrah and the Lord warning people before they're destroyed. Talked about the worth of a soul and how Abraham would barter. He bartered with the Lord. What if I can find 50 righteous people? How about 45, 40, 30, 20, 10? And it doesn't happen. But talked about that. That was a good little discussion with my students about the worth of a soul. And then we just talked about wickedness and happiness. And you can't find happiness in sin, because there is no happiness in sin. And so it was a great discussion. This was a great quote from President Oaks that the students really enjoyed. A lot of people writing down parts of it, taking a picture of the thing, linking it to this conference talk in their own gospel library and things like that. It was really good. Then we talked about Sodom and Gomorrah and how they weren't supposed to look back. And I said, before we're too critical of Lot's wife, think about the last time you were on the freeway and there was an accident on the other side of the freeway. Traffic slows down. Why? Well, because everyone's looking. It'd be tough not to look back. And also, just as a side note, and I told all my students this too, on Disney Plus, there's a documentary called Buried Secrets of the Bible, and they do a whole archaeological evidences of Sodom and Gomorrah. If you're looking for 45 minutes of something to watch while you're on the exercise bike or the treadmill or something, I found it quite enjoyable. So just if you want to watch it, that's one I'd recommend. And I told my students that too. But then I loved this quote from President Holland, that it wasn't just she was wanting to look back, she wanted to go back. And she was kind of resented having to leave her past behind. And I talked about what that would look like in our life. You know, what are you leaving behind? What do you leave behind to go serve a mission? What do you leave behind to be an active, faithful member of the church? And if we spend too much time longing for that and resenting the fact that we can't do those things, then that might be problematic for us as well. And so we had a good discussion about that. We also talked about with forsaking sin. I love that quote that was in the manual from Elder Anderson about forsaking requires time. And so to be patient with ourselves. And so I brought it all full circle. This was all one day from the beginning of this little part right here to this point was one day. And I tied it back into patience. And we need to have patience with ourselves also in repenting and in that whole process. So that was the end of day one. And then I went on another day and we discussed Abraham and Isaac. And the story of Abraham and Isaac, I talked about when he was born, covered those scriptures, how old was Abraham at the time. And then I also pointed out to them that while artists may kind of depict Abraham as a teenage boy, maybe in this one, or in the manual they have an artistic rendition that shows him as even a younger child. I think most scholars would agree that Isaac was much older than what these depict, probably in his 20s, maybe even 30. If I had to, be pinned down for my guess, I'd say he was probably 33, just for the symbolism factor of it. But yeah, we just did that, and then we talked about Abraham's test. And on this slide, all I did was read verses 1 and 2 about the test, and then asked him what the hardest part would be. And, they shared some various things that would be hard, and I shared with him, I thought one of the hardest things would be Abraham trying to explain this to his wife, Sarah. And I thought that would be difficult. But then instead of reading the rest of this, I actually just showed the video. It's linked in the curriculum, or you can find it just by searching the word Akeda on the church website. And it's a good little rendition. It's a little over 12 minutes long, 12 and a half minutes long, of this whole story. And it shows some real heart-wrenching moments and things like that, and shows some of the difficulty of it. It shows Isaac as being definitely old enough to require him to be a willing participant in it. And then I just posed this question: what are the similarities between this story and Jesus Christ? And I gave him a few minutes. I gave him about 5-6 minutes to write in their journal on these things. And then before I went on to those last two questions those last two bullets on this slide, then we just had a discussion. I let them share some thoughts, and they brought out the parallels between Jesus Christ's sacrifice and the story of Abraham and Isaac, and I also took them to Doctrine and Covenants, section 34, verse 3. After they talked about how God sacrificed Jesus, Heavenly Father sacrificed Jesus, I took them to section 34:3, where the Savior says that he gave himself a sacrifice as well, and gave him a great cross-reference with John 3:16 to Doctrine and Covenants 34:3. So we did that, had a great discussion there. Then I asked them if we'd ever be tested like Abraham, and most of them, emphatically nodding their head no. And then I went to Doctrine and Covenants 101, 4 and 5. And then we talked about that. And then I just shared these quotes. One from Joseph Smith, which is just a kind of a reiteration of section 101. And then this one from Elder Neil A. Maxwell. This is the one that President Holland apologized for daring to paraphrase a few years ago in conference. And it was well received, and we had a good discussion about that. And then I wrapped up with this one going way back to 1980 from President Packer, about all the testing being different. We're all tested in different ways, but there's more equality in the testing than we might suppose. And so I really love that thought that we're all tested in different ways, and that there's more equality in the testing than we sometimes think. And so that was the things that I did. Again, it was a pretty good discussion in all that we did. The students really had some deep thoughts about it, particularly the story of Abraham and Isaac. They're the ones that brought out all the parallels. It was pretty easy just to let them lead the discussion and to guide it. And they came up with some really good things after I gave them 5 or 6 minutes to just ponder and think after watching that movie, The Akeda. So those are some thoughts for you. Your classes might be a little shorter than mine. And so this, might take you more days than what I just went through in 2. But and honestly, I would be better off to break it into 3, 2.5 or whatever. But anyway, some great material, great lessons. I hope that you have an enjoyable time with it in guiding your students with this one and helping them to see the importance of the doctrines and to see Jesus Christ in these stories, and to do that all with love in our hearts for our students. So make it a great week. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you later.